Hello, everybody, and thanks for listening, watching. My name is Karim Sultan. I'm a curator for the Kemal Azar Foundation, and I'm joined here with, or by Batool Desouky, who's a computational artist working with technology, archival research, and magic. Her work uses magic to interrogate notions of technosolutionism, productivity, and personal agency. And taking magic as the ancient sister system to computing, she builds custom software based on medieval Arabic mathematical studies of objects known in English as magic squares. Her work is rooted in the Arabic history of the talismanic use of magic. And Batool is also the co-founder and editor of an online publishing platform called Tarif, which commissions experimental works by artists and writers from the Swana region, Southwest Asia and North Africa. She started Tarif to create a space for artistic and discursive exploration outside of the museum and gallery space. So thanks so much, Batool, for joining in for this conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for asking me to do this. I'm really excited to talk about these things in this context.
So am I, most definitely. And one thing that we're going to be doing is starting off with the current exhibition at B709 Art Station in Tunis, Seen and Unseen, and begin with some of the themes of the exhibition, and in particular one artist's work, and then use that as an opportunity to explore your own research and practice as well, which is quite fascinating. I'm just going to quickly discuss some of the relevant themes and the works of Hannah Malala, who's an exhibiting artist at Seen and Unseen. And so one of the things that that kind of characterizes, both in terms of the selection process, but also the works themselves in the exhibition, is this idea that the works have a kind of embedded internally coherent or consistent logic, and that the works are produced, but then it's almost as though things are left out, things remain kind of unseen, which ties back to the name of the exhibition as well. Where and in particular, the work of Hannah Malala, which is the earliest work in the exhibition, actually produced in the late 1990s in Baghdad in Iraq, where a number of sort of a great amount of research in semiotics, systems, mathematics, and the histories of things like talismans, the magic square, the royal game of Ur. These kind of systems are very much embedded in the work. But what you're left with is something that's where a lot of these things are hidden from the viewer at first glance. So this is a process that that we might call occultation or occlusion, kind of hiding intentionally from the viewer. So this is, I think, an interesting starting point to talk about your own research and your own work, given the fact that there are some interesting parallels.
Hannah Malala's work kind of engages with the same artifact. I call it a mathematical artifact, which is the magic square, which I use as kind of like the central object of my research. However, like the way that I apply it is a bit more technical, in that I use magic squares as kind of an ancient program that I try to work with to create a software program, and from there talk about magic and technology and the spaces between magic and technology, and kind of how to move back and forth between like a technical space and a more poetic or magical space, and how that really manifests like to create an artwork or a research project.
Which is fascinating, and it's quite interesting that there is this practice from from the 1990s and your current practice as well, that have this underlying sort of saying that a lot of the material, the research, that's the primary material, has a lot of resonance between one and the next. But obviously, with Hannah Malala's work, the kind of the end results, or the what we see in the gallery, is a mixed media work, sort of a two-dimensional work that's hanging. But your work is the end result, or the process of your work is, or the output, you could say, of your work is quite different.
Yeah, I mean, I guess because I was engaging with it from like a systems perspective, and I ended up like building software to create the work, it just kind of made more sense to follow I guess the mechanical body of the magic square and to work with it as a system, as opposed to like an aesthetic engagement. Yeah, and I think that like working with technology is kind of brings up different questions and different, like has a different like urgency to it, I guess, within like the moment, the present moment. Certainly. And yeah, I mean the output of the project was actually like multifold. Like it wasn't just the software. The software ended up creating a piece that ultimately became a book. There's a few physical components, but yeah, it's difficult to embody the process because it is inherently a system. And so it kind of remained in many senses like intangible, or to use your phrasing, occluded.
Occulted.
Yeah.
Actually, before we get into, because I think it would be good to get in depth into the research project and the output that you've been working on and are producing, but just on the notion of occultation and occlusion, there's some interesting aspects there that I think we can sort of cover more generally and thematically before we dive into your own work.
Yeah, so I mean, occultation, I guess, like, I mean, in the process of my work, there was two kinds of things getting kind of lost. There was like an unintentional process that doesn't really get to be forefronted, and then there was a purposeful occlusion that is a bit more inherent to say the magic square and the history of the magic square, which is related to like magic and sigils and symbols, and kind of ties into like the larger conversation around semiotics and symbols. And in that sense, there's an intentional occlusion there where like you leave out certain parts of the workings of this object to kind of, as a way of protecting it almost. So you choose what you make decipherable and what you keep keep hidden to kind of like preserve the power of the thing. And that's I think at the essence of working with the magic squares, working with like symbolic systems in general.
And I think there's an aspect of that as well, which I think is personally quite fascinating, in the sense that when things are made overly legible, when things are almost too direct in a work, there's how would I put this? Basically, I think when things are kind of intentionally removed or made more illegible or kind of more hidden, there's a kind of an assertion, I feel, of the artist, especially in the gallery space, where when things are immediately perceived or apprehended, the work is kind of the work takes on its own life, its own power, but by keeping things occulted, by kind of keeping things more hidden, and the viewer or the curator or the institution has to almost like work to sort of there's a kind of a sense of work that's transferred onto the viewer or to the curator, whoever it is, who has to kind of deal with the artist who's not necessarily present at the moment, but the agency is still being asserted, even though the artist might not be directly there in the room, which I think is quite fascinating.
Right. Yeah, I think that those choices are part of, I guess, what like reclaiming a narrative is about, or like, or claiming a narrative, or forging a narrative is about. Like you basically choose to construct the story around the parts of your work that you want to put up for discussion, or the things that you don't want to put up for discussion. And for me, this also echoes like a larger narrative that that I felt like I was engaging with, which was the history of the magic squares. I don't know if you want to get into this now or if you want to do this later.
So before getting to some of the kind of the bigger themes behind the things that you're talking about around the magic squares, around systems, around occultation, reclaiming narrative, there's so much to talk about. But I think to kind of frame that, let's talk about your current research project and its related artistic output, Programmoire, which is an interesting portmanteau of
program and grimoire. So actually, maybe that's a good spot to start.
Yeah.
So Programmoire is kind of like it's a technical engagement with, I don't want to say ancient, but pretty old magical practices. One of which is the practice of keeping grimoires, which were essentially like recipe books for magical purposes, like casting spells or making potions, and combining that knowledge in kind of a compendium.
Like a collected volume or tome or book, or
yeah. And from the and the other part was the program part, which is where like the magic square comes in, and the software process of working with the magic square to create a software. So essentially, I started working with the magic square because I was engaged in like this back and forth between technical spaces and poetic spaces, and kind of, and found, and when I came across magic squares, they were like kind of the perfectly positioned artifact to do that, because they were at once like inherently computational, because they're numerologically bound, but they were also applied within like esoteric and magical practices. And actually, maybe this is a good point to mention that magic squares is only their English name for them, because of how the manuscripts traveled at the time into Europe. The manuscripts that made it into Europe were the ones that dealt with using them for spellcasting and these kinds of things. However, they were also like mathematical objects that in Arabic are called awfaq.
Awfaq.
And they
what does that translate to, if you don't mind me asking?
It's kind of like, it's to do with like ideas of harmony, like numerical harmony. It's like awfaq al-a'dad is the full phrase for that, which is like numerical harmony. And they existed in like a mathematical space, essentially, and were studied. I mean, they're a very old object. Like, I think the first traces of the first written record of magic squares comes from like the 1st century, but I don't go that far. Like, I specifically focus my research on the Arabic tradition of them, which is why I'm using like the Arabic name and stuff. Yeah, so they were studied within like mathematical contexts and like scientific contexts, and they later became used for like magical ritual and potion making and spell casting and astrology. And in that sense, they were really fascinating for me to work with, because they provided this kind of bridge from the technical mathematical space and the esoteric and mystical space. Yeah, so that was kind of the roots of the research. What emerged since then was like, because I work with coding and software, the next step was to then look at their structure mathematically and import it into a code, into a program. The program part of Programmoire. And that process was, that process opened up like a lot of questions, which I think we're going to go into later.
Certainly.
But yeah, so making the software was a long engagement and back and forth with both technology and what it means to work with technology, magic, what does magic mean, different definitions, alternative definitions of magic, and how they could speak to technology. And so yeah.
Yeah, there's I think one aspect of this that I find, and you touched on it as well, given the fact that there's an artifact that was recorded and transferred, became translated into new contexts and took on a new different meaning, and I think and you mentioned that the idea of reclaiming narratives,
Yeah.
as which I think is might be the next kind of point that we can jump to, and I think this is something that's quite interesting before we kind of get into sort of the more thematic or into sort of the technical aspects of it. This idea of reclaiming narratives. If there's something you want to say on that, I think we're just...
Yeah, it was, I mean, so the choice to focus on the Arabic tradition was very much informed by this awareness of narrative and awareness of like Western definitions of magic versus non-Western definitions of magic, and how magic is kind of became trivialized within the Western context, whereas, and became kind of separated also from its technical parts. Whereas like before it made that transition, the distinction between what was mathematical and what was magical was really not there. They were part of the same kind of scientific space, and it was deemed scientific at the time because that's what science was at the time. And so that kind of like multidisciplinary, like kind of inclusive way of defining what magic is was really interesting for me, but also it felt important from a cultural perspective, to kind of provide an alternative definition of what magic could be, and specifically also within the context of technology, because magic is, I think, more recently being discussed as part of like the technological space, and it's usually allotted the space of like the unexplained, like the thing that happens that we couldn't predict, and that mystification of it also is part of separating it from the way that it actually works, because it has this like, and I'm talking about magic squares specifically, not like all magical practices.
Of course, yeah.
Because they have this like technical foundation structure. They're actually very explainable. They're not mystical or strange things. They have a logic within them. It just so happens that it's not the logic that is recognized or agreed upon by the larger, like, I don't want to say like the larger narrative or the larger like system. So yeah, so for me, it felt like this was an important way to counter narrative those things and open up a different space to talk about like some of the history of like magical practices, and also some of the history of technology,
which seem quite intertwined. And it also reminds me a little bit of there's that kind of relationship to science fiction, that well-known quote by Arthur C. Clarke, I believe it was, who talked about any technology that's sufficiently advanced to the observer seems to look like magic in a sense, and which I think kind of there is when there is something that seems to have an underlying logic that seems to sort of work in ways that aren't readily or easily explained, it sort of seems it's identified as magic. But as you pointed out, these are often things that the magic in it is how. So for example, let's say like how these underlying systems that seem quite mysterious are actually can be worked out through mathematics and through kind of technical practice and technology. I guess would it be sort of these kind of processes were an earlier kind of system of computing, I think, no? Would that be sort of a stretch to kind of call it that?
No, it's not a stretch at all. It's like, it's actually like quite like the elemental, like base level way that computing functions and that magic functions are almost identical. And that was part of what made this so fascinating for me as well, because I was working within technology already. And it became apparent that a few very basic rules were at the root of both magic and technology. And that's like basically like the use of symbolic logic and assigning functions and actions to symbols. So like within the syntax of the code, like software code's computer code, not like ancient code, which is also a code. Within the syntax of software, you assign functions to symbols, essentially, numbers and letters. And in the same way, magic assigns functions or powers to also symbols, sigils, specifically talismanic magic, sigils and symbols. So I found that this parallel made it really like generative space to interrogate technology, essentially, because here was this other system that works in exactly the same way, but doesn't have some of the like presumptions that come with technology. Like it's not, for example, like magic is not efficiency focused. So it was a good space from which to question ideas of efficiency and ideas of productivity, in that they're not necessarily inherent to technology, but they were transposed on top of it, and problematizing that was something that I found to be possible through working with magic.
Sort of looking at the assumptions of I guess, in the sense where technology is kind of seen as an end-all be-all solution for both, I think, broader social, cultural kind of issues, but even in terms of making artworks, where, for example, if something is kind of more like utilizes the technology in a more advanced way, then you have a better artwork, which I think isn't necessarily the case.
Yeah, this was something I also had to ask myself in the process of making this too, because from a technological standpoint, the choices that I made were quite inefficient. Like it ended up producing, the software eventually ended up producing like large amounts of permutations based on the magic square, all these like hundreds of thousands of symbols that like were slow to generate, and they took up a lot of storage space, and it was a clunky process working with them, with the code and storing them, and having to like really kind of take care of my laptop, which was starting to get overwhelmed at this really inefficient process. When I could have just used like a machine learning model, for example. But then throughout the process, one of the questions that came up was like, why did I assume that I should have used a machine learning model? And this is where some of these like technological presumptions come in. It didn't actually make sense to use something like that just because it was more quote unquote efficient, because it made more sense in the context of the magic square to use the process that I ended up using, because it basically borrowed from something called combinatorics, which we didn't go into yet. So maybe I could take a moment just to explain what that is.
Of course, yeah. But I was also thinking as well, before we jump into the the combinatorics, we can sort of maybe put that point on the side for a moment, but because I think just for the viewer / listener / participant, maybe to talk about, because I think it's interesting. There's a huge world that's kind of opened up in the research, and I think I'm kind of curious about the challenges of inhabiting this world, but then kind of producing the process of sort of the process and kind of the output of that.
So, okay, so the software generated hundreds of thousands of sigils, and eventually, going back to the grimoire tradition, I decided to take them back out of the digital space. I mean, not that they started as a physical thing anyway. Magic Square is more of it's a list of rules more than anything. It's kind of an abstract thing to start with. But so I wanted to kind of manifest them into something. And so I looked into different ways of printing it, and eventually decided to use a plotter to kind of mechanically use a pen and draw them out one by one. Of course, I didn't get to produce the entire thing as a physical drawing because there was just too much. There was just too much. This is something that I'm working on now. But at the time, I chose a range of permutations and worked with a plotter and basically plotted them out. And what working with a plotter allowed me to do is kind of retain some of, again, the rules of the magic square, which is to have like a linear progression throughout the grid. And instead of like laser printing it, for example, where like it happens instantaneously, a plotter allowed for like a more iterative process to build up each page at a time and each square at a time. So yeah, so that was one of the outputs of the project, was this, the bound. Eventually I printed, I don't remember how many pages, but eventually I bound them and they will become part of the bigger book, the bigger grimoire part of it. Yeah, so that was part of it. Another aspect was the installation. And the installation was kind of a display of the process, like a display of the mechanism. It included a screen that was running the program live, and it was tied up to like a bunch of things like Raspberry Pi and some stuff. And that was kind of connected to a small receipt printer, which was kind of communicating with the program, and every now and then it would print out one of the magic squares, like physically. So yeah, so the installation was like a process view of the work.
And in terms of the kind of the initial, let's say, for example, there is this sort of all these permutations, all this, everything that's being produced by the plotter, everything that's kind of being processed by the computational process that you've set out. But was there kind of an initial starting point? Because I think that's what's I'm kind of curious as well. Like, for example, was there kind of an initial set of numbers or a kind of question that you're sort of asking into the machine? I'm kind of curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, the starting point was to ask how to go about building it, because there were several different ways to build a magic square, including several different, like, I would call them medieval algorithms. And they're like sets of rules to build a magic square that were in like the mathematical treatises. I think that's how you pronounce that word, treatises.
I think so too.
Yeah, and kind of referencing those to create a different kind of set of rules, like a different kind of algorithm that would work better on a machine, like on my computer, computer basically. And so generating the logic for that program was really the starting point of thinking about how to produce this, because it had a different set of considerations that were not aesthetic. So I couldn't just start with a grid, which is what the magic square looks like ultimately. But it didn't make sense to start from that space, because I had to think about like the affordances of a machine. Like, a machine doesn't actually have any spatial cognition. So to make it think that way felt like I needed to anthropomorphize it, but I wanted to do something that was like intuitive to the machinic process itself. And that was why I ended up using the algorithm that I ended up using, which ties us back to combinatorics, which includes like a step-by-step counting and reordering of the numbers in the grid until it eventually arrives at the correct math, which is, the magic square. So
interesting.
Yeah.
And just to kind of, because I think this is a word that has almost like lost its meaning, which is algorithm. I think. Which I mean, it's one of those things. I think, for example, on one's own personal favorite streaming platform, they the comment sections are full of the algorithm has done this to me or whatever. But but I think in this case it refers to a specific process or a specific how would you define
set of
algorithm?
rules.
Set of rules.
Set of rules. essentially. The word algorithm has its own history. I mean, essentially, it's a set of rules. Whether those rules are like analog or digital or computational or whatever, it's a set of rules. Yeah.
It's sort of, and basically because the magic square is just essentially kind of a, would it be a sort of a spatial configuration of numbers, or it's sort of numbers arranged in a certain?
Yeah, it's essentially a matrix of numbers,
Matrix.
and I don't know, matrix is a big word, but like it's a grid, and inside the cells of the grid are the numbers, and the way that you compute the magic within a magic square is basically you add up all the numbers in the rows and the columns and the diagonals, and when they add up to the same number, you found your magic square.
I see.
So if you were to follow like spatial algorithms or like medieval algorithms, you just place them on the grid in following a certain pattern, and you achieve the magic square. What I had to do was to not think spatially and to think about it as in a really abstract way, and to only think about it in terms of counting and reordering, which is essentially what combinatorics is. I think this is a good opportunity to define combinatorics.
Exactly.
It's just the process of counting and reordering elements within a finite space. So the numbers from like 1 to 9 are essentially the numbers inside the smallest magic square. It's the one that I worked with. And you count and reorder them until you achieve the math that you need. And it's, as you can imagine, it's tedious and long, but that's what computers are good for.
That's what they're there for, basically.
Yeah.
And so you begin with the kind of the initial algorithm that sort of tells the machine to sort of, you know, execute or to produce as many of these as possible continuously until the right math emerges.
Actually, yeah, it doesn't do it until the right math emerges. It does it until it's out of sequences. It runs out of permutations at some point. And that is, by then it's generated like hundreds of thousands of permutations. I'm not exaggerating, hundreds of thousands, which is why it was so inefficient. And then within them, well, the way that I built the program is that it would highlight for you which ones were the magic squares. So once you go through and you look at the sheets and pages of these permutations, it would highlight the ones that are actually magic. And there's only 8. There's only 8 that are, only 8 within the 3x3, within the smallest one.
Out of potentially hundreds of thousands of different results, basically. And one interesting thing that that just sort of came to mind is the fact that, you know, it's not spatial. These aren't things that are objects in a certain physical space. They're not. I mean, even numbers aren't necessarily. You have to sort of add a step to make them visually represented. So there is something kind of, I think almost there is something quite mysterious, I think, about numbers and about this kind of computation, in the sense that they almost don't they almost don't exist. They exist in a completely different kind of realm than everyday objects. Like relating them to a shape or to a, you know, a collection of things or an applied mathematical sense. That's you're sort of that's an added step, but the actual numbers themselves are quite abstract in a very mysterious way.
Yeah, this is why I like the Arabic name of magic squares. Magic squares has a shape in it. It has to be a square. But the Arabic name just means like harmony amongst numbers, which I think is a lot more fitting for what they're like.
Which is kind of quite interesting, and I think that's something that sort of gets lost when things obviously, you know, change context and places, and, you know, across history, where there's, you know, there's you gain the kind of practical aspect of, okay, this is, and, you know, this is what it is. This is it, the name sort of tells you the process of how to produce one. But what's lost is this kind of that other sense of which might be embedded in the word magic. I'm not sure, but the sense of there being this kind of very, it's actually difficult for me to find the words, but I think abstract is probably the closest thing I can think of. But this abstract realm in which numbers can exist, and you're there kind of just pushing them along and kind of arranging them in a certain way. But there's a sort of, there's an underlying motion or like a logic that's kind of that's quite separate from the spatial physical aesthetic realm.
Yeah, and it's inherent to software as well, which
Mm.
again ties back to the parallels between magic and technology. Is that, you know, software works in exactly the same way. There's a, you know, you see the interfaces of things, but the abstract logic is in the back end of everything.
Which
So yeah.
actually, yeah, that sort of, that makes sense, I think, because I think most people's interaction with, for example, when they think of a computer, they automatically think of, for example, the graphic user interface, the desktop, or the phone with icons. But those are basically very sort of distant representations that are designed to make things easier for the user, but they don't really relate to actually what's happening in the code or in the processes behind the scenes, in a sense.
Yeah, I think in the same way, like producing symbols from something like a magic square, or like using sigils and things, is similar in that you choose to occlude the mechanism of your talisman, and it exists in the world as a symbol, um, and I guess it knows what it's made of. You know, to have like an object oriented aspect on this, um, and it's like, you know, it's set to inherently hold its own like function or power or whatever it is,
Mm.
but without necessarily revealing the rest of it. And maybe that's not needed. My process was, I was really invested in kind of keeping everything. So I ended up keeping all of it and displaying as much of it as I could, you know, within practical reason. Um, but as a way to also have this conversation. So, you know, as a way to talk about occlusion in a sense, or symbolism or the occult in a more like magical way, by
Mm.
kind of, you know, really investigating its structure and trying to like also like archive it and make it, well, create it so that it's auto archiving itself. And there's this whole, you know, it became really expansive at some point.
Like, I think there's a couple of points that come out of it. One of which is, I think, because at the end of the process and the output in your work, there is something that people sort of look at, and there's something that's, I think, for me, has personally has a kind of its own aesthetic value to it. It's very striking to look at, and even, for example, both, we'll have this pop up on the screen, the videos,
Mm.
but I think in the book itself, and also in the kind of the video output that of the permutations kind of manifesting themselves, there is something very aesthetically pleasing, I think, to look at, and it's there is something that relates to kind of abstraction. There's something that's you know, that looks like a process in motion that can be seen as its own thing, divorced from the kind of the underlying algorithm and process. But I'm wondering what kind of like, because there was obviously a decision making process that you had to kind of engage
Mm.
with to show these permutations in this
So
algorithm.
okay, so different parts of it needed different kinds of reasonings.
Mm.
The book, I mean, I had to decide on the size of the book and the format of the book. That was one of the biggest um, like decisions that I remember like stopping at and being like, how do I do this? Because I'd created the program to fit in my laptop screen, which was 6:10 aspect ratio, kind of an old school laptop,
Mm.
um, which wasn't necessarily compatible with any standard paper size. And then when I went to work with the plotter, it had a limited space that it could work in that was A3 sized.
Mm.
So it then became, I had to basically, I either need to like reprogram the code to make it lay it out as A3 paper, but how does that make sense for like an inherently computational thing? How do I then take this to work with a plotter that's printing in the standard A3 size? And so in that process, what eventually ended up happening is that I printed the pages in the 6:10 ratio, and then just kind of fit it in somehow into the A3 space. And that's why the book has this really weird format. It's really wide with a lot of blank space on the side. That's how that came about.
Interesting.
And I think there's some potential to work with that size translation between formats and mediums. And I think for like the future of like when I create the rest of the book, it might borrow from some more traditional manuscript layouts and really take, you know, really embrace the margins, which was, you know, these manuscripts really put all the information in the margins. The margins are fascinating spaces in those documents. And I think that's part of what's interesting me at this point, to look technically use the technical process to engage with like historic or non-technical things. So that was that. For the installation itself, because I was, the installation was an opportunity to show the working process of this. So I wanted to position it as like a working station, as like a tool or something. And so I laid everything out on the, like I drilled everything into the wall basically, and didn't try to like polish or package anything. There's like some exposed circuit boards there. There's wires everywhere. And I just kind of, I imagined like if I were producing these things in a workspace that would work for me. Like, let's say I am, I don't know, like a technologically advanced, like ancient magician. How would I build my own tool? It was like that. And so from there, I just kind of put all the components there, and I wouldn't say with very little aesthetic consideration. Of course, I had some aesthetic considerations, but focused a lot more on like, what would this be as a tool, as a workspace? And that's kind of how the installation was built. If you stand in front of it for long enough, you just might see it print a square.
Oh, interesting.
It's essentially running without repetition. It ran without repetition for like 3 continuous days. So every now and then it would arrive at the square and it would print it. But in that sense, there was also this like durational aspect to it.
Of course.
So yeah, it depends on like when you happen to come upon it. Yeah, part of how I think about computational arts in an artistic context, and almost from like an art history context, to me, I find it kind of similar to systems art, where basically like you have a set of rules and you set out to enact those rules, or you use those rules to govern a certain moment or a certain space, and then the result of that is the artwork. So in that sense, I related a little bit back to systems work, systems art.
Actually, the thing that you mentioned about duration and time, the sort of the temporal aspect of the work, I think is that's another interesting thing as well. And I think it ties into some of the concerns that I'm also dealing with this particular exhibition. But I think in the sense that when you look at the object, it's, you know, it doesn't necessarily tell you much about the time embedded within it, but there are sort of clues, I think. And I think in the case of your work, just the as you mentioned, there's much faster and easier ways to kind of do things. For example, if you were choosing to do a different process of printing, if you chose to use sort of machine learning versus the particular algorithm that you'd coded, but the things that the choices that you made almost kind of allow time to be kind of embedded or accreted. They sort of builds up in the work. It's just even in the long durations that it takes to compute or to print, and the image of the plotter is also quite striking as well.
Yeah, so part of that actually, which I forgot to mention, is that every single permutation is indexed, so they're all numbered, and you can see which index number the program is at a given time, which is the program's own way of recording time as well.
Okay.
Because it's counting per permutation.
And that's sort of a time scale that's not a human time scale. It's not one necessarily. That's it's sort of an internally kind of it's a time scale that's basically defined by the by the computer, and it's sort of the computer is keeping track of time for itself, not for you or for me or the viewer or anybody else. It's sort of internal.
It's for its own progress, yeah.
Which is quite fascinating, I think. But and even in terms of how long did it take to sort of print out, to sort of plot rather the grimoire itself?
Several days. For
Several
those,
days.
yeah, for the, I'm still forgetting how many sheets I ended up making, but it took like 3 days for those. Yeah, it's long.
Which is, yeah, quite a time-consuming process. And also I think, you know, relating back to the kind of historical aspect, there is something about, I think, because even until relatively recent in history, computers were people, right? You know, like, for example, let's say if you were at NASA in, you know, the 1960s, computers were actually just a room full of
people in a room.
Yeah, and going back to kind of the earlier, these sort of earlier kind of computational processes, very much was somebody with a pen on paper and kind of working these things out. And I think there is this historical echo that's in the work as well. When the machine is kind of actually going and tracing things and writing them out on paper, and the algorithm is sort of taking its time and not happening kind of instantaneously, there is this sort of historical echo of those earlier moments of human computers, of people actually having to do the math themselves on the page. And so Programmoire is a kind of, I think, an expensive research project that has, you know, potentially many iterations of output. But I'm just curious about what's next in terms of your research. Are there other horizons or avenues that you're continuing to explore, or?
So yeah, of course, producing the rest of the book is the most immediate next step. Another thing is I'm also building a little web space to display the same output, but in a more like interfaced kind of medium. Because I do want to preserve the digital aspect of it. The book is kind of an object in its own right, and I think the non-physical part will also need to become its own thing. So there's that. But then in terms of the research, I think I mean, what I'm starting to look into now has more to do with the Arabic magical tradition and how to bring it all back to telling that story through all this like technical cycle that I've been in, to tie it all back to how to conceive of this from a kind of like, I guess, like historically and culturally situated perspective. So yes, that's what's next on the research front.
Perfect.
I'm not sure what shape it's gonna take, but that's the next research step. Yeah.